Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. As president of the International Political Science Association, IPSA, I'm pleased to welcome you to this webinar organized by the International Science Council and IPSA. Today's webinar, Pandemic Politics, What Have We Learned, is the latest example of our organization's longstanding collaborations. IPSA has been a member of the International Social Science Council, ISC's predecessor, since 1952, and has collaborated many times in our respective histories. The global pandemic affected us in ways that no one could have imagined or have predicted. Despite the preliminary research of political scientists on the impact of the pandemic, we will need years to understand the whole picture. The pandemic's most noticeable effect has been visible on the global economy and has worsened existing inequalities, especially in the US, for example, among minorities, women, and low-income groups. Some of the world's countries that see themselves as most advanced educationally, and also in terms of public health, have faced some of the greatest challenges in eliciting cooperation from the public in controlling the pandemic. Countries that have encountered rapidly spreading diseases in the past have in some cases been more successful in responding rapidly to the COVID-19 pandemic because they faced the threat before and understood how to mobilize. As a global political science association, the International Political Science Association has reflected on the pandemic quite early and under the leadership of my predecessor, Marianne Kneuer, who's here today. The association launched the Regional Dialogue Initiative held at the end of 2020 and early 2021. These dialogues discuss the impact of the pandemic on academic life with our 61 national and regional associations worldwide. During those online meetings, various topics were covered, including the impact of the pandemic on national and regional political science associations, on teaching at universities, research conditions for faculty who still were conducting research, how the pandemic affected faculty, members, and students, the challenges of teaching and learning online. And of course, for those universities and countries where online teaching was possible, many of us had to learn to do it in very rapid order. Finally, I would like to take this opportunity to invite you to the 27th IPSA World Congress of Political Science that will be held in Buenos Aires, Argentina in July 2023, under the proposed theme of politics in the age of transboundary crises. The call for proposals will open in May 2022, and we look forward to receiving your abstracts and panel submissions. I'm delighted to be able to be here today and to, with you, enjoy listening to this panel. I wish to thank the ISC for inviting IPSA to partner and co-sponsoring this event. I'd like to thank my predecessor, Marianne Kneuer, the former IPSA past president, for accepting the invitation to join the panel and participating as a discussant. There's a very lively and exciting group of discussants that will also participate. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Dianne, for that welcome and for providing the partnership of the International Political Science Association with the ISC in this event. The International Science Council, as Dianne just suggested, is an organization formed by the merger of two groups previously representing the social sciences and, quote, the sciences separately. And the ISC has brought together the former ICSU and ISSC because, among other things, of a conviction that science is not sharply divided between natural and physical and medical and social components, that these are all important, that we bring together various kinds of specialists to understand the world in which we work. So I thank David Kaplan, who has represented the ISC in this, and Heidi Hackman, its leader. Let me briefly introduce this panel and our panelists. This is part of a series on the social sciences that recognizes them as complements to the natural, physical, medical sciences and engineering, but also as intertwined with them. And the pandemic is a good occasion to recognize the extent to which there is not a sharp separation in the world of science. Science has performed relatively well in the pandemic in relation to a number of institutions that have not always performed well. That doesn't mean it hasn't been issues, and that doesn't mean that it has generated universal trust in the products of scientific research as they become part of either policy or daily life. But social science and public health, to which social science as well as natural and medical science are important, has also been changed by the pandemic. So this series of webinars, which has included webinars on economics and psychology and sociology, and now political science, explores both the ways in which these disciplines have contributed to understanding the phenomena around us, in this case, the politics of the pandemic, the way in which the pandemic has been shaped by and reshaped global politics and national politics in some countries, and the ways in which social sciences have themselves been affected by the pandemic, in which new issues have been put on the agenda, in which we've recognized weaknesses in previous perspectives, but also strength in previous analyses that needs to come to the fore. So the pandemic has pushed forward some new thinking and new work in social science, and we'll be privileged to hear about parts of this. Our main speaker is Professor Jane Duckett, the Edward Caird Chair of Politics, Director of the Scottish Centre for China Research at the University of Glasgow. She's one of the world's most noted specialists on China in general, and on the, if you will, political science of China, but broadly understood. Among other things, Jane is the author of an important book on China's retreat from health, the ways in which China, like some countries in the West, pursued policy agendas driven by economic and other goals that called for retreats in the area of health that have had effects in the context of the pandemic. She's worked significantly on China's response to the pandemic, and she will speak about that and about political science and about global issues. She is a recipient of many honors, and in her introduction, I'm going to establish a precedent of not listing all of the honors of each of our panelists so that we can get on to the panel. Let me briefly tell you who the discussants will be, and we'll transition after Jane in this order. We have Margaret Levi, who is the Sarah Miller McCune Director of the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford and Professor of Political Science at Stanford, as well as a holder of other appointments there. And she is the former president of the American Political Science Association, winner of the 2019 John Skype Prize. Oh, I said I wasn't going to announce any of these honors, sorry. And an important thinker on a range of questions from tax policy and movements to the future of a moral political economy and how we might have a broader and richer political economic perspective on key issues. I suspect that will come up in her comments today. Marianne Kneuer, as Dianne has already indicated, is past president of the International Political Science Association. She's professor of comparative politics at the Technical University of Dresden. Her research focuses on democratization and autocratization, the quality of democracy, not just the sort of on-off switch, do you have it or not, but the quality, the impact of digitalization in democracy. These are all issues that have come to the fore, and she chairs research projects on solidarity in times of crisis, one of which is directly on solidarity in the context of the COVID-19 crisis. Her areas of work are really global, but include especially Latin America and Southern Europe and Central Eastern Europe. And our third discussant will be Adebayo Olukoshi, who is a distinguished professor at the University of Witswatersand in Johannesburg, South Africa. He has previously been the director for Africa and West Asia of the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. He's director of the UN African Institute for Economic Development and Planning, and has held a number of other key institutional roles in the social science and more broadly policy arenas for the future of Africa. I won't list again all of his previous honors and awards, but I do want to mention his recent recognition with the Vice Chancellor's Distinguished Award for the University of Excellence and Stature at the University of Johannesburg before he moved across town. All right, with no further ado, and merely an announcement that Jane Duckett speaks to us as an extraordinary global authority who will demonstrate how to give a great talk when your PowerPoint has just become technically inaccessible. Jane.
Thank you very much, Craig. Yes, this will be not death by PowerPoint, although I may kill you in other ways. But thank you very much indeed. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak. I'm really delighted to be giving this presentation today and to join such a distinguished panel. I'm somewhat awed by the distinction of my colleagues. So I hope we'll have a really interesting conversation this afternoon. As Craig said, I'm a political scientist at the University of Glasgow, specializing in Chinese politics. And since April 2020, I've been leading a project about the Chinese government's handling of COVID-19, with a particular focus on its early policies to contain the pandemic and their impacts on society. But I do straddle, the Chinese studies and political science boundary, and also sometimes the health and these three. I'm at the cusp of these three different fields, really, of health policy as well. I'm going to speak a little bit later about the politics of China's response, but I was asked today to look broadly at the political science discipline and what it's contributed to understanding the pandemic. So I'm going to speak first about those issues. My aim is first of all to kind of review the questions that political scientists have asked, set out some of what we've learned so far, and then reflect on what this tells us about the strengths and limits of the discipline. Although I look forward to also my colleagues perhaps being able to draw more out of this, of my talk than perhaps I can in terms of strengths and limits. But I'm basing my talk both on work with which I'm familiar due to my own project, and also on a review that I did in preparation for this presentation, where I looked around, I did a sort of a review of published papers in the field. I should say that I'm focusing on political science research. So this is academic research. I'm not going to include papers and books published in health and medical science journals, or those written by journalists, works written by journalists. I'm sticking to the political science discipline itself, but it's interesting just how much work has been, or how many references there have been to politics in the health and medical science papers that I've seen, which do write about the pandemic. I think for a lot of people working in health, politics has been very important in their view to understanding the pandemic. I made a search of Scopus using words like COVID, coronavirus, and politics. I just wanted to sort of see what's already out there. And I also looked at the individual sites of some of the leading political science journals in the US and the UK primarily, and Europe. Overall, I found more than 170 articles already published on the politics of the pandemic. But this isn't a sort of systematic review. I didn't do a formal review, and I don't claim that what I'm going to say is in any way an exhaustive summary of the discipline's response to the pandemic. I will inevitably have missed some very important work. And there will still be a great deal of work in the pipeline, of course, given the publishing timelines of many journals and the time it takes to do really good, rigorous research. There's still a lot that we're going to be learning from our discipline about the politics of the pandemic in coming years. It's only been 2 years, of course, since the pandemic, less than 2 years since the pandemic began. And political scientists are still trying to make sense of what's happened and what is happening. And it's evolving before our eyes, and the nature of the political problems are changing as we're doing the research, which makes it all the more difficult. Of course, you'll have noticed from my discussion of where I've been looking for work on politics, that I am inevitably going to be excluding a lot of work written in other languages, and that a lot of what I say will really reflect the discipline as it operates in Europe and in North America, and perhaps Australia as well. This is just a bias in what I'm saying, and I'm hoping that my colleagues on the panel will correct some of that with what they can contribute. I will say a few words towards the end of my talk, however, about the political science research being published in China in Chinese, just to kind of give some balance to that, to give you a sense of what's happening there. But for the most part, I focus on English language scholarship coming out of North America and Europe, and I want to be clear that I'm aware of that bias, and I hope that we can overcome it in the discussion by looking at perhaps what's being done in other parts of the world, as research being done elsewhere. What I offer today is going to be an initial contribution and perhaps a provocation. I hope at least it's a starting point for discussion. So let's just begin by, how did the discipline react as the pandemic evolved? From where I'm sitting in Scotland, I could see that there was a huge amount of research. People rushed to look at what was happening, to try and make sense of it, to make grant proposals to research it. What was clear pretty quickly was that a huge amount of time and effort was being put into data gathering and creating databases of material. There are many of these, but a few notable examples include the Oxford COVID-19 Government Response Tracker, which was set up by the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford, which focuses on measures that governments adopt worldwide, and it tries to track those. It enables it to compare the stringency, for example, of measures adopted worldwide over time, and produce really nice graphics to help people look at what governments have been doing over time comparatively around the world. There's also COVID-Dem, which I think was launched by the University of Melbourne. It's a global democracy and pandemic tracker that aims to help researchers track, compile and share information on how COVID-19 is changing democratic governance, so the impact on politics in democracies around the world. And there are many others. Just a more modest contribution is my own project, which, as I said, is on Chinese government's COVID-19 policies, and has collected over 1,000 Chinese policy documents into a pretty comprehensive database of mostly national policies. There are also lots of web pages dedicated to collating published and unpublished work on different dimensions of pandemic politics. And these types of databases reflect perhaps the fact that some forms of data gathering was more difficult, at least in the early stages of the pandemic. For example, face-to-face surveys and fieldwork. But political scientists have been creative in drawing on existing survey data and other sources, as well as generating and collecting new data. So there certainly was a lot of activity. And so we created databases. We from our homes quite often around the world, we tried to understand what was happening through the material that we could access online, and thank heavens for the internet. But what have we learned from all of this? Of course, political science is a diverse discipline. It encompasses public policy, electoral behaviour and political institutions, comparative politics and international relations, political theory and political communication, and that's just to name the key subfields. There's been work on the pandemic across all of these. I found, for example, work in political communication that analysed public health communication, comparing red and blue states in the United States and the US, and some that examined conspiracy theories and the politics of fear in Brazil. But there was also some work, there is work outside of these main subfields of the discipline. For example, a small cluster of papers on the consequences of the pandemic for climate change, or for the role of the state, or for the extent of conflict around the world. For example, there was one paper that's been published which found conflict to be reduced in the Middle East during the pandemic but to have increased in Southeast Asia. Most of the work I found fell either into international relations, comparative politics, or the politics of particular individual countries that focused on either policy, public opinion, or elections. And all of this work essentially considers two sides of the same coin. And Craig, I think, alluded to this in his introduction. First of all, they look at how politics shaped national and international pandemic responses. And second, there's work which looks at how the pandemic has shaped politics around the world. What I'm going to say now, and for the rest of my talk today, is going to focus a bit more on the former, on how politics shaped pandemic responses. And there is more of that, I think, in the works. But there's a large number of papers coming out on things like the impact of the pandemic on voters, on elections, on nationalism, and these kinds of things. But let's delve then into a little bit of what we've found and what we've learned so far. I'll mention briefly international relations, although this isn't my own field, and so I haven't probed it quite so deeply as the comparative politics. Work in this subfield, the subfield of international relations, has examined international cooperation around the COVID-19 response, international organizations and the role they've played, and it's also looked at the consequences, or begun to look at the consequences of the pandemic for geopolitics. So this includes I think inevitably some of the early work is somewhat speculative when it comes to looking at how the pandemic has impacted geopolitics, the new world order in which China is seen as rising, and globalization. Although I think it's probably too early to say what the long-term effects of the pandemic are on these, given that it's still playing out, and we could perhaps come back to that later. It's kind of interesting to see how we've had to grapple with what appeared to be, the first wave of the pandemic, initial successes and failures in dealing with it, and then over time, now 2 years in, having gone through a second wave, and some countries who appeared to be successfully containing the pandemic initially, then having more problems, and China having done a reverse almost, with starting off with rather disastrously, then containing the pandemic, but now wondering how to get out of its zero tolerance approach to COVID. But in addition to the work that's been looking at geopolitics and globalization and the impacts, these sort of wider systemic impacts, there have been quite a few papers looking at the international relations, how they've been affected in particular regions, for example, within the European Union, how the pandemic's affected relations there, or within Africa and within the Persian Gulf. So there are some specific sort of regional studies going on. Some studies have asked why there wasn't better international cooperation. I think this is going to be an ongoing and fruitful area for research. There's been study looking at what hampered the World Health Organization's efforts. There's one really interesting study which, for example, did a particularly rigorous analysis, a qualitative analysis of a corpus of 458 documents to show how the World Health Organization has delegitimized in global governance by countries that were seeking to undermine it and undermine what it was doing. So I think there's some of these really these really rigorous studies which take some time to do. I'm sure there's much of this in the pipeline. I'm going to say a bit more about comparative politics as well. This is the subfield within which I've been working in some respects, and so I'm more familiar with it. In this subfield, there have been some within country comparisons done, and again, perhaps my colleagues on the panel could say some more about this, particularly the work within the US, where there's been a lot of work, I think, done comparing, for example, different types of states and their responses to the pandemic. So for example, papers have asked, so already published papers have asked whether red states or blue states responded differently to the pandemic, or whether partisanship affected public compliance with pandemic policies. And the answer to both of these questions is yes, but there's still more being done there. There's been studies also, though, looking at subnational responses elsewhere, some really interesting work on India, comparing states there, comparing, for example, Kerala and Gujarat in India to understand the variance in the responses within country. But mostly in this subfield, the focus has been on comparing national responses, or at least that's my perception. Perhaps that reflects my bias and my interests. But a lot of work has asked which countries or which types of countries handled the pandemic best and why. Some of the early work, which came out in 2020, was asking about regime type. So, and this is also a very popular kind of question in the media. Were authoritarian or democratic political systems handling the pandemic better or worse? What we found is that both authoritarian states like China and Vietnam and democracies, for example, New Zealand and Norway, have all been successful. So both authoritarian and democratic states. But both authoritarian and democratic states like Russia, the UK and the US have also struggled to prevent high numbers of cases and deaths from coronavirus. So that institutional distinction doesn't seem to be very helpful. There was some early research also trying to look at the comparison, to compare presidential versus parliamentary institutions with similarly inconclusive results. I think much research, actually, a lot of the focus has actually been on the relative strengths of, from an institutional perspective, the centralized versus federal systems as well. So some work argued that federal systems have had more fragmented responses and been slower to react. But actually, some other papers have disagreed with this. And more recent work has concluded that it's not so much whether a country is centralized or decentralized per se, but whether intergovernmental cooperation between national and regional governments works, and whether those responsible have the capacity to do what they should. There's a paper by researchers, Obrecht, I think is the way you pronounce it, and colleagues, published in 2020, which looked at a comparison of the European Union and the United States responses to COVID-19. And it argued that actions seeking to limit the impact of COVID on society need to reflect what they call a smart mix of both centralized and decentralized responses. So centralized procurement and distribution of medical goods can solve problems. For example, the problems of harmful competition between states, or the problem of some subnational states hoarding goods. However, this paper argues that the use of these goods and the implementation of measures like, for example, testing programs might be best done through a decentralized process where local authorities have an information advantage over central authorities. So you need to be kind of what some people would call horses for courses. Centralization is useful for some things, but decentralized responses for other things. So the studies I've just mentioned start with a macro institutional context and look for patterns, but they haven't found very many so far, but I think inevitably we're starting with the big questions and then drilling down and then refining our questions as we proceed. This doesn't mean, of course, although the answers are not very clear when it comes to institutional influences, it doesn't mean that the institutions don't matter. I'm quite an institutionalist myself. Notably, for example, regimes and political institutions really matter. If you look at the lack of transparency and media freedoms in authoritarian states, they've mattered a great deal in the pandemic. In both Russia and China, the authorities have been able to control narratives about who is to blame for the pandemic. In Western European democracies, governments have had to contend with challenges to their policy choices from within parliaments and from across society in ways that authoritarian states haven't. And so I think it's really important to, not to disregard those institutional influences, but just perhaps we're going to have to look more carefully at the ways in which they work, not simply at whether they, produce a good or bad response to limiting the number of deaths, for example. There's a lot to get into. So At the other end of the spectrum, you might say, from the work which looks at institutions and starts with institutions, other researchers, perhaps people coming more from a sort of policy background, started to look at the measures the countries adopted. And here we see this is the type of rationale that underpins the Oxford COVID tracker database. Here, the focus is on looking at what countries did and then trying to assess the most effective policies and responses. So there have been actually quite a few studies done comparing different combinations of countries on looking at which did, what measures were used more or less successfully. Some studies also look at individual states. Some studies focus on countries that did well in containing the pandemic, or at least in the first wave, and others have sought to understand what went wrong, what didn't work well. This work has argued that certain measures have been particularly important to handling the pandemic, although some of these early conclusions, as I said before, I'm not sure that they're going to hold for the whole period. But if we're talking about trying to initially contain and prevent the spread of a pandemic, then effective testing and tracing, quarantining, restrictions on gatherings and movement, and healthcare system capacity, especially having intensive care units, have all been found to be really important to an early and rapid response. These studies have kind of focused down to these kind of consequences, these kind of measures as the key measures. And now I think the attention is beginning to turn to understanding the speed and timing and the sequencing of measures and which of these work best. The speed seems to have been important, for example, especially in closing borders, but neither this nor timing and sequencing have been thoroughly studied just yet. Then, of course, looking at measures and what was done leads us back to the question of why different places adopted different measures and what accounts for the differences in their success or failure. And again, there's been work done taking this perspective. A really interesting, and I thought potentially quite interesting paper, potentially influential paper by colleagues called Capano and others, published in 2020, suggests that rather than regime type or political system being really important for success in containing a pandemic or reacting quickly to move quickly to contain a pandemic, actually what was key was previous epidemic experience, and they're starting with a kind of more inductive approach, quite a semi-inductive approach. So previous epidemic experience, and this enhances preparedness and correlates with a swifter and better response. One of the interesting findings from that study was that in fact, having a good health system might be problematic because it actually enhances complacency. Countries with good health systems kind of thought they could rely on the health system to handle the problem, and therefore perhaps reacted more slowly in a preventive way. Now, what comes out of this then is also this question of why did countries act the way they do. A lot of attention has been paid to the question of leadership. Leadership seems to have emerged as an important factor, even if it's one that's difficult to explain. But there has been some work which has shown that the gender of leaders makes a difference, with female leaders acting more decisively. And another recent study I came across by Forster and Heinzel, which shows that leaders who are more educated, I think they call them technocratic, but essentially leaders with PhDs reacted faster and more proactively than those without. Statistically speaking, there was a statistical study. So we're kind of probing these kind of areas. Why did the responses vary? What made a difference? There's been quite a lot of work in the area of capacity, state capacity, and then looking at knowledge and science capacity and how that's shaped how leaders and governments have responded. Knowledge and science is really important. It affects not only what leaders and governments can do, but it also what they know, and also what they know they can do. And so, for example, test and trace capacity was limited in the early stages of the pandemic for many governments. Many governments therefore relied on modelling, but modelling was more open to challenge and debate. And so, perhaps, increased the hesitancy to act. So science capacity is important. Political scientists have explored other dimensions of capacity, though. Kavanagh and Singh in 2020 published a paper that noted that global health circles there are conventional measures of capacity and preparedness for pandemics in global health circles. And the WHO and other organizations produce kind of league tables of pandemic preparedness and so forth. And these have turned out not to be very good predictors of ability to deal with COVID-19. The US and the UK ranked top in at least one of those global league tables of pandemic preparedness. As it turns out, in fact, different countries had different capacities, and perhaps other capacities than those you would expect matter for responding to the pandemic. So, I've mentioned scientific capacity. In a positive way, it helped German testing and British vaccine development. But governmental capacity was important. The South Korea has a very effective CDC system. And China demonstrated a rather different kind of political capacity, its capacity to mobilize officials and party members to penetrate right into neighborhoods, to prevent people from moving around, keeping them at home, and using repertoires of policing and surveillance to do this as well, which enabled them to, and that was really critical to them containing the pandemic. Now, because democracies are not usually able or prepared to use the types of measures that the Chinese state used, another focus of research in sort of Western political science, European and North American political science, has been to look at public opinion, trust in government and politicians, and the consequences for compliance with COVID containment measures. So compliance has become a big issue, and one which political scientists have sought to understand, asking questions like, do people trust the COVID apps? Are citizens willing to pay taxes to deal with the pandemic? And looking at which political attitudes shape responses to policies such as social distancing. Is it your political your position on the political spectrum, for example, which shapes your understanding or your response to government measures and government requests to social distance or wear masks. So there has been work that shows that political trust was really important to the success or failure of some government responses, some governments around the world. Okay, I focused above on what we've learned from political science about the pandemic and how to contain it. As I said, there's been some other work which I don't have time to deal with today on the impacts of national politics on election. There's been quite a lot of work on elections and voting, where elections have been held over the last 2 years, on nationalist attitudes. Does the pandemic enhance or reduce nationalist attitudes? Apparently it's reduced them in some segments of the population in the US. There's also been some interesting work, for example, on language politics in South Africa, finding that the government during the pandemic has kind of communicated in more languages, and this is changing the way that languages are used in politics there. So there's some kind of really interesting things coming out of this kind of research. But before I conclude, I wanted to say something. I thought I would say something about China's handling of the pandemic and what we've learned from scholars of Chinese politics about China's handling of the pandemic. I'm saying this partly as a sort of way of kind of balancing my focus rather on Europe and North America, and also because it's the area in which I've been doing research, and so I thought there might be some interest in it, and it's something on which I can speak. So. I also do this to exemplify the kind of research that's being done in what might be called area studies politics, the politics of particular countries, where people come at the understanding of politics from understanding in depth the country that they're looking at, its culture, its language, and so forth. Now, these kinds of studies tend to be less often published in perhaps mainstream political science journals, but they are out there, and I thought it'd be useful to talk about this just so that people become aware, to make people aware of that. And the same would be true of not just Chinese studies, but of other parts of the world as well, of course. So studies I'll only deal with this really briefly, but studies of China's handling of the COVID-19 response so far have tended to see China's responses falling into two periods. that initial period of obfuscation and lack of transparency, where the local governments and perhaps with the central government covered up the outbreak of a new pneumonia of unknown origin, was what it was called in the very early stages. And then there was a second period. So people divide that early period from the second period beginning around the 20th of January, when the party state began to very decisively act to limit the spread of COVID-19 and introduced very, very stringent policies. And most of the focus of the research has been on the second longer period. And researchers have sought to answer why China managed to successfully contain the pandemic between January and April 2020. So it went from looking completely out of control, really rapidly rising infections. We all saw the footage coming out of Wuhan with chaos and terrible scenes in hospitals there. But by March, even by February, the infections are falling. Hospitals were getting it under control. How did they manage to put the genie back in the bottle? A lot of people have been looking at that. Overall, the consensus, I would say, at the moment anyway, the kind of most of the research has focused on that ability to centralize government and party organizations, use them to mobilize and penetrate into the neighborhoods, mobilize people and move resources around the country as well, use IT and surveillance really actively bring in members of the community in across cities across China and villages across China to get everyone involved in the whole act of containing the pandemic. So the focus tends to have been on that. So there's a kind of a focus on those institutions in the same way that we've looked at centralization in wider political science. More recent work on China has begun to examine the differential responses of China's provincial and sub-provincial governments. So we did focus a lot at the center at the beginning, and it looks very centralized when you do that. But there was some provincial variation in how governments responded, and there's been work in China and outside of China looking at that. Okay, so I won't go on that any longer. I won't go on about that any longer. I just wanted to say a little bit about Chinese political science research, again, as a sort of counterbalance to my focus otherwise on Europe and North America. Although I did come across some papers in the Scopus search that were in other European languages than English, it didn't turn up work in different languages. But political science research in China is highly constrained currently. Under Xi Jinping, the scope for critical research has narrowed in recent years. And perhaps in this sense, China seems like an unusual case, but I think we should remind ourselves that many of the world's population live in authoritarian political systems of one kind and another. And so political science as conducted in those parts of the world operates somewhat differently and is more constrained. Overall, political scientists in China are largely focused on researching how their own country handled COVID-19, although they do also look at the international implications, for international society, international relations as well. Most political scientists, though, are having to be very cautious in speaking out and saying anything negative. And one of my colleagues said to me, and this is a quotation more or less, when deep assessments are not possible, researchers sometimes prefer to keep silent. And so some people are just not really researching this topic because they feel you can't say anything very constructive. But Chinese researchers have tried to explain China's institutional advantages. Some of them in support of the government are talking about the advantages of the Communist Party's leadership and socialism with Chinese characteristics and so forth. But there are others which are really interestingly looking at public sentiment in response to government messaging, how to improve responsiveness in the future and strengthen planning, and the impacts of the pandemic on society and international relationships, as I said. A lot of Chinese political science research is really geared to problem solving and to policy, to sort of informing policy. And I think in a way, in a much more than often political sciences in the West, for want of a better word. So stepping back actually to think about what political science has contributed to understanding of the pandemic. I'll wrap up now, and what it tells us about our discipline. I think we can consider the extent to which we perhaps as a discipline on the whole in Europe and North America, we tend to be less directly trying to inform policy as compared with some of our colleagues around the world, perhaps. As you can see from what I've said, though, the contribution from political science on the pandemic has been wide-ranging, and I've only been able to give you a flavour of the range of issues that people have looked at. I think what political scientists have studied reflects our expertise and skills and knowledge. So we tend to come to it with our own particular subfields, obviously our knowledge from those. We've rushed to use our skills to understand this key defining event of our times. As a result, though, our response has been somewhat piecemeal, reflecting, inevitably, I guess, reflecting the fragmented discipline. And I think there's still a lot to learn. I think we've really only just scratched the surface. As I've indicated, I think we've looked at the big questions and found that the answers are, it's complicated. The simple answers aren't there. We're going to have to get down into the detail a bit more. And there's still a lot that we don't. So there's still a lot that we don't understand. I think from the review that I did, most of the research was where it was comparing countries, was comparing Europe or US or other rich nations. And we seem to know, at least we seem to know a lot less about other parts of the world. I think we don't yet understand really the community level or the local level politics very much around the world. And I think obviously the pandemic isn't over. The big questions about geopolitics, international organizations, and the new world order will take a lot of time to evolve and become apparent. And this question of international governmental organizations and why they didn't handle the pandemic better, I think I could turn on that question to Tana Johnson, who wrote a really interesting paper saying that international relations research is making sense of why those organizations didn't work better in the pandemic, but doesn't say enough about why leadership is not better in these organizations and what to do about it. And I think that's the question for us really. Is I think one of the weaknesses of our discipline, if I might say so, is that we tend to be good at explaining what's happened and less good about saying what we should do about it. But I think I'd like to end with some questions really for the discipline, taking that whole idea about what can we perhaps do more proactively to change things in the future and engage with policy. Can we help to improve cooperation in times of crisis or in times of pandemic specifically? Can political science help us understand what governments need to do better to be better prepared next time round? And does our discipline, can we indicate where political systems could improve or change so as to improve effective action in future pandemics or in other crises? So I think I'll leave it there, and I'm really looking forward to hearing my colleagues respond or give their views on this very, very large subject. Thank you.
Jane, thank you for that really richly researched and informative talk. This was exemplary in telling us about political science, about politics at different scales and with different foci in the world, and about the pandemic. So really bringing lots to the forefront and reporting on the already published research. We acknowledge, though, that we hope this is also a contribution to the continued production of the research. And a lot of people have mentioned in the chat their research projects that are underway in a variety of different settings and the ways this will contribute to them. I want to highlight for everybody who is busily expressing their thanks, but also their requests for citations, that the ISC will coordinate with Professor Duckett and will post links on the website, the same website, so that people are able to find her work and that of the authors she cited. Now let's turn to our discussants. And they have free range to bring in different kinds of questions and perspectives on the various issues raised by Jane Duckett and by the research she cited. So lots of things on the table. I'm going to resist the temptation to be one of the discussants, stick to the moderator's role, and call on Margaret Levi first, professor at Stanford University and director of the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences. Margaret.
Thank you. And thank you, Professor Duckett, for that amazing review. I won't be correcting, can you see me?
Yes, you're fine.
Okay. Okay. I won't be correcting the bias in the conversation so far towards the OECD countries. I'm going to be focusing on those and largely on the US. And I will be referencing some of the databases that Professor Duckett reviewed. I'm relying largely on publications not only in the conventional political science journals, but also such outlets as PNAS, the Proceedings of the National Academies of Science, where they have had a special set of articles by political scientists, political sociologists, and political economists thinking about issues of COVID. What I'm going to try to answer, in fact, one of Professor Duckett's questions about what we might do in the future and how we can correct some of the problems that we've seen in this last period. And I'm particularly interested in what these studies tell us and data tell us about politics, government, and citizen responses in democracies. A lot of my work has been on trustworthy government and when citizens support it with relatively willing compliance with its extractive demands. So even when it uses coercion, government still requires a large number of its citizens to believe it is right to comply. Effectiveness and legitimacy of government depend upon that. So what happened during COVID? As I said, much of my focus is going to be on the US. Sorry, having trouble getting to where I want to go here. Much of my focus is going to be on the US, and particularly on partisan differences within the US. The COVID pandemic, while a nightmare for us all, is also a dream opportunity for social scientists trying to tease out such questions as what difference it makes to both the course of the disease and the response of the citizens to have a government that is trustworthy as measured by its effectiveness. The best mechanisms for informing the public about the science and having them believe it, the variation in responses among populations with a given polity, as well as responses of subgroups to different levels of government and different agencies. The experience of COVID since February 2020 provides a wealth of data within countries and across them, and some first-rate analyses are beginning to emerge from the flood of papers taking advantage of that rich data, though it's still early days. In any kind of regime, it is important to evoke as much willing compliance as possible, even when compliance is legally required. In a democracy, behavioral consent is foundational to the system, and thus even more critical to achieve. And it appears, as I expected, that voluntary compliance with government recommendations for social distancing, mask wearing, business and school closures, and vaccinations reflect the perceived trustworthiness of government and its agencies. The more a subset of the population has confidence in a government agent or agency, the higher will be the behavioral consent and the lower the level of resistance to mandates, ceteris paribus. There are, of course, always complicating factors. Conformism can sometimes do much of the work, but as we know from simple perception, as well as from historical cases, different groups develop different social norms. In the United States today, different norms appear associated with different party IDs, identifications. There is a partisan difference in confidence in the information provided in the federal government. And there's also a partisan divide in behavioral responses. Republican voters are less trusting, but also often less informed. And Republican governors are less likely to impose stringent rules on their population. Other subgroups, particularly those who are less educated and less well off, are also less likely to comply, but only some of the reason is trust. As a British study reveals, those less likely to afford compliance are not surprisingly also less likely to comply. And as the US data shows, some people hesitate to get vaccinated out of fear of losing work time and thus pay. The source and content of the message also matters. It can resonate or not with the social norms of the group and alleviate or not its reasons for distrusting government. Some of the most compelling work on this question comes from studies of the mobilization of religious practices in the control of smallpox and Ebola. For example, Purna Singh, in her study of the variation to the uptake of the smallpox vaccine in China and India in the 19th and early 20th century, uncovered profound distrust of anything that came from the colonizers. However, China employed messengers and messages that resonated with its culture, thus essentially ending smallpox. India did not until this century, when it was then able to effectively eradicate the disease. In these studies of earlier vaccines, as well as in the present case, it is becoming very clear that community engagement in how to handle mandates and health recommendations is an important component of encouraging willing compliance. The COVID vaccination uptake in the US is a story of an objectively trustworthy federal government, but disbelief and distrust in their messaging by at least some of the population. A recent study reveals that vaccine hesitant Republicans are likely to take positive cues from Republican elites, but to harden their opposition to cues from Democratic elites. One cross-country analysis suggests that when the government leader's policy is put in terms of the harms noncompliance would cause, trust in the leader decreases. Framing the policies in terms of benefits enhances trust of the leader. Some of the most interesting observations come from a recent report of the COVID States Project that examines the decision not to get vaccinated among the US population. Using online surveys that include both open-ended and closed-ended questions, the authors found that of the respondents, 67% of them were vaccinated, 15% were non-vaccinated but willing, and 18% non-vaccinated and resistant. Focusing on the non-vaccinated, they found that the major reasons had largely to do with perceptions of risk, often reflecting lack of good communication more than misinformation. But also significant, although not nearly as significant, was distrust of various institutions, agencies, and actors who were critical to the creation and delivery of the vaccine. Despite the widespread argument that the unvaccinated mistrust science, this may not be the case. However, they do mistrust many of those who communicate about the science. In the United States, believe it or not, a lot of people distrust Dr. Fauci, and we know they distrust the media outlets. When democratic governments move towards mandating vaccines and lockdowns, the question becomes whether the public reacts positively or negatively to legal requirements. Mandating vaccines could crowd out voluntary compliance among many who would be willing to get vaccinated. However, the most recent evidence suggests that, at least in the United States, a mandate can enhance vaccine uptake by those who were hesitant rather than resistant. They were confused, they weren't sure, this helps them make the decision. While there is considerable cross-national and cross-regional data on the objective effectiveness and capacity of government, the data are not, as far as I know, yet adequately linked even to surveys on trust in government, let alone to behavioral responses. Moreover, measures related to effectiveness are not the only basis for trustworthiness. There is also procedural fairness, and as I will argue, engagement of publics. So there is a lot left to learn from the pandemic experience. However, there are some lessons we can take away from the research to date. Contemporary as well as past democracies fail to be perceived as trustworthy to some of their crucial publics when there is inadequate institutional attention to the plurality that constitutes the democracy. Yes, most democracies guarantee minority rights and recognize the varied demands of multiple races, ethnicities, and creeds. But how we recognize those demands comes up against the standard of universalism, a defining quality of rule of law and of liberal democracies. Democratic polities still hold high the value of treating all citizens the same, ceteris paribus. Although there is increasing attention to how to compensate for inequalities that affect life chances, the vote count, the law, and many bureaucratic regulations are based on universalistic principles. Yet in considering something like social distancing, perhaps rules need to be better tailored to the context. Rural populations are not the same as urban, and poor people have different problems than the rich. Many public policies do indeed tailor policies and implementation to the needs and norms of particular publics, but with COVID, as in many other cases, the starting point is too often universalism without sufficient nuance. Universalism is not the same as uniform treatment. I will conclude there. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. That was really helpful. And among other things, along with what Jane said, a reminder that politics and political science are not only about what governments narrowly understood do, but a broader set of relations that include governments. Let us turn now to comments from Marianne Kneuer, as I mentioned, a former president of IPSA, our co-sponsor in this event and professor at the TU Dresden. Marianne. Marianne, you're muted.
So, okay, now it's fine. So thank you very much. And I'm very excited to be here. And actually, my perspective is a little bit different from Margaret and also from our keynote speaker, because I will talk about the impact of the pandemic on our discipline. And I will base my observations, I will base on my observations during my presidency of the International Political Science Association, which overlapped with the pandemic quite a bit. But I also base on my own research on solidarity and the COVID-19 pandemic. And the lesson of the pandemic that I want to discuss today is the public role of political science, because this public role obviously has gained or regained relevance. Generally speaking, and here I can reflect the diversity of positions that I have learned as president of the IPSA, indeed, there does not exist a consensus among political scientists if they should have such a public role and if they should engage being audible and visible publicly. But independently from this diversity within the discipline on this question, actually the pandemic did boost the demand for scientific advice. And now this new recognition of science may seem like a positive lesson for us as political scientists. And of course it is. But I want to make the point here that this is fraught with some ambivalences. And the first ambivalence, the first ambivalence refers to trust in science. On one hand, trust in science has skyrocketed. Our consortium, my research project, conducted a 3-wave survey between August 2020 and April 2021 in Germany, and we found that among 13 political and societal actors or organizations, general practitioners were the most trusted at all 3 points in time, consistently approaching 80%, and scientists in second place at a stable 2/3 of respondents trusting them. So on one hand side, we have this huge trust in scientists again. But on the other hand, a certain lack of understanding arose relatively soon in the public when experts presented different views, when they announced different studies, or when they presented different interpretation of studies. So the insight into the fact that the scientific search for knowledge does not offer an imperative for equal results and does not offer the one and only truth with the one and only way to get there was a difficult lesson. So I even would say that this afflicted partially the image of science and of political science also in the public. And this might be even a bigger problem for political science than for natural science, insofar as political science always is multi-perspective, uses different methods and approaches, and the answers we give are not neither homogeneous nor always unambiguous. The second ambivalence I want to point out is about the different logics in the world of media and science. The media were and are highly interested in giving experts a stage. This is good for scientists and for political scientists because it's only then when we are really able to have an impact on the public. Many political scientists see this as an important mission of their profession also. For one thing, however, not all scientists are trained or prepared to act on the media stage with its own logic. And Margaret also referred to this problematic logic some seconds ago. And on the other hand, two different logics collide here. Journalists want to get pointed, simple statements and clear messages, but scientists argue in a balanced way, always have the complexity of context in their mind, and the messages are based on these premises. So, and then in addition, political science findings may not necessarily match perceptions in society or in media. Let me tell you one of my experiences. Because of the relevance of my research on solidarity in the corona pandemic, I have been often approached and interviewed by journalists. And I often found myself facing an already preconceived position on certain aspects and questions. For example, why has solidarity failed in Germany? Now, my first task was then to make clear that this question is already based on false premises, insofar as neither the results of studies nor the evidence could prove it. Then two things can happen. You either get through with your message or you don't. So finally, a very practical ambivalence in this public role. Who decides upon the person that appears in the media and the public as an expert? Those with the most relevant findings, those who take a deviant position and therefore are interesting for media coverage, or those who have the time and resources to engage in media appearances. And this might be those scholars, by the way, who have big teams and of assistants and research assistants, and who have the infrastructure to do elaborate media work containing podcasts, blogs, twittering, etc. So here could lie a problem due to asymmetric resources between different experts or scientists. And this refers to the countries in the global north, it refers to the countries in the global south, but it also refers to transnational biases that can appear. So concluding, let me say that political scientists, for some time to come, especially when crises become the new normal, will be more in demand and more needed with our findings, our opinions, and our recommendations, our advice. At the same time, however, we should reflect more about the mechanisms and the complexity of this public role that we as political scientists have. There is 3 levels in this complexity. The relationship between political scientists and politics, so decision makers. The second level is political scientists and the public. And the third level is political scientists and media. So I think there is, or this complexity needs to be reflected in a more thorough way, and especially also the mechanisms of the interaction which we are immediately in when we get public as political scientists, as scholars. There is, again, no unanimous opinion in our discipline about the extent to which one should interact with the public or not. And this is something which is open for discussion, I would say. But for those who see a public role as a mandate, and I would count myself among them, we would need actually to re-evaluate and to reflect on these mechanisms, which I described, and how science can fulfill its public role on the basis of the experiences we made now with the COVID-19 pandemic. Because again, I think we might count that with that crisis become the new normal. So unfortunately, possibly the next crisis is there already, out there already. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marianne, for great comments about political science in particular, but which also have relevance for other disciplines, for science and scholars generally. I can't resist noting, I'm struck that when we think about the public role of scientists, we think about those with whom scientists communicate, as you indicated, the general public, policymakers, so forth, the media. But one of the questions is also how our disciplines take on new problems and identify what it is important to study for the future of public understanding. So this is a great discussion already, and no doubt will get greater as we turn to our third discussant, who is Adebayo Olukoshi from the University of the Witswatersand in Johannesburg. Adebayo, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Craig, and thank you to the colleagues who spoke earlier on. There's a lot which resonates with me in your leading presentation, Jane, particularly the warning, which I think has been evident over the last 18 months or so. That it's extremely difficult to make a correlation between regime type and the effectiveness of response to the pandemic. In my previous job, when I left a few months ago, we actually did try to play around with some correlations of that kind and came exactly to the same conclusion as you did. Questions also of trust, which have been raised by Margaret, resonate very much with me in the corner of the world where I am. And it is from the vantage point of that corner, Craig, that I'd like to make a few observations. A lot of them I would summarize under the broad rubric of silences and asymmetries in the way in which the discipline has attempted to understand, respond to, and critique all of the developments around the pandemic. And quite easily, you might remember, in fact, Craig, that a few years ago, before it was wound down, merged into the with the ISC, the ISSC had a World Social Science Forum in Bergen, under the broad theme of one planet, worlds apart. And I think our experience over the last 18 months has simply reinforced this notion of one planet, and worlds apart at all levels in the management of the pandemic, which I believe ought to comprise an important part of the response by our discipline to a more balanced and more globally integrated kind of answer to future pandemics, on the assumption that already the train left the station as far as the current pandemic is concerned. And these silences and asymmetries, we can begin at the level of the narrative. When the pandemic burst out in China, in Wuhan, sitting in Dakar, Senegal, where I lived down the first round of the lockdown, it was not difficult at all to get a feeling from the dominant voices on the global scene about an impending apocalypse for which Africa was going to take the worst possible beating, and even prompting Emmanuel Macron to make a plea for an immediate global mobilization to save Africans, right? This was against every evidence with regard to levels of infection, to even levels of deaths and the like, but certainly speaks to a certain perception of Africa in public health terms, but also of an equation of power, which was very rapidly in the face of that apocalypse failing to happen in Africa, shifting very quickly to narratives about putting together aid to the continent, and very quickly an aid narrative baptized under the name of the COVAX initiative came into play. Again, basically reproducing the same asymmetries in the global order, the inequalities that have always been an integral part of Africa's engagement in the world and with the world. And here I think it's important to note that even in places on the world and the continent, which were sites of experimentation for some of the vaccines that were later developed, very quickly, it was now a question of servicing the OECD countries, as I think you put it, Marianne, servicing the OECD countries as a priority, and later on thinking in terms of what might happen to the rest of the continent of the world with regard to vaccinations. So again, there we see asymmetries that play out, and in our interrogation, some of the silences, which I feel ought to have been at the fore as much of our engagement with the science of the pandemic as with the politics underlying the way in which response has been mobilized on a global scale. Very easily, I think the message for most on the continent, the way we interpreted it, was simply that really at the end of the day, in spite of much talk, it's never been more close together than we are today, in which some of our colleagues have argued that even geographies don't matter anymore. We suddenly find that geographies do matter, and a new vaccine nationalism has been the order of the day. I think it's also important here for us to interrogate what voices get heard and which voices get silenced in the global conversation around the pandemic. And it's not simply, in my view, enough for us to focus on which scientists or which particular fields of science take the forefront in engaging the public around the pandemic, as much as also those voices that simply don't make it to the table at all. Voices around indigenous knowledge systems, which comprise part of science, but which in fact are never themselves privileged to be part of a broader conversation. And I think this is important because for many, many on the continent, including myself, the saving grace in many respects was the capacity of local groups and individuals with good knowledge of herbs in the absence of vaccines and other interventions effectively to be able to help to manage the pandemic. The case of the Madagascar herbal products, of course, got a lot of publicity globally at the early stage before it was discounted. But many, many, many such combinations were to be developed and for which vast local markets exist, even to this day, in terms of not just the absence of vaccines, but of skepticism and distrust that has built up around the vaccination program. At the fourth level, I would also like to raise a broader question of how we manage the tension between the imperatives of public health and the demands of democratic governance. And we saw this in very raw forms in many parts of the African continent. In Dakar, as I said, where I lived through the pandemic when the lockdown happened, with very little notice to the population. It was almost like a stealth operation. People woke up and were told that as of a certain time later that day, a curfew was going to be in place and the lockdown was going to be enforced. In the context of almost 60% youth unemployment, of 70% plus levels of absolute poverty, announcing such measures with very little notice said a lot, I think, for the political savvy and governance acumen of those in power. But more broadly, was the fact that in many countries, governments thought it was also within their jurisdiction to use force to enforce lockdown, including beating up and brutalizing people, using the policing services, and in some cases even bringing out the military to enforce lockdowns. And here again, I think for many human rights advocates around the African continent, a serious dilemma was posed, recognizing, of course, that there was a global public health emergency, but also insisting that enforcement measures designed to contain the pandemic ought to be done in accordance with the rule of law and with respect for human rights and the dignity of individuals. As somebody put it, you can say to me that jollof rice is good for me, and that a meal of jollof rice once a day would be good for my health. But it's another thing to force feed me jollof rice, even when I don't feel hungry or have a desire for that particular meal. And I think it's precisely this feeling that has continued to prevail, even with regards to issues of the vaccine mandate. Finally, in view of the constraint of time, I would also like to put on the table questions which have been posed in my own corner of the world around why lessons from previous episodes, previous pandemics, have not featured properly. Has our political science lost an historicity that enables us to be able to point to certain things that might enable us to avoid some mistakes that may have happened in the past and others that may provide useful lessons for ensuring a much more effective response. And I think it's on this particular note that I feel that in terms of our own public engagements, global advocacy, even as we undertake our science, we ought to put a bit more emphasis on the importance of long-run historical data, including of the qualitative nature, as opposed to instantaneous kinds of data that look at contemporary developments and what they might mean to enable us pose questions that may speak to the concerns of a broader segment of the global population. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adebayo. You raised a number of really important points in this. I want to pause and note the last one that you suggested, the extent to which, for all of our talk about preparedness, we seem to have a deficit of learning and the learning from previous experiences that can inform response and policy, as well as more academic understanding. And it is striking in many ways that how much people have been focused on the very contemporary and the need for more. You also brought out something else that I think is important, and it takes us back to Jane's talk, and I'm about to turn to her. And this is the extent to which the typical very strong emphasis on the nation state of most political science needs to be complemented by attentions to the local and to the transnational in various ways. And the sort of implicit nationalism of lots of accounts that look at nation states as though they're the whole of the story. And you point, I want to add, both to the local in the sense of the community and the global, for example, the production and distributions of vaccines and the way in which this has been organized. I think that that Africa also should point our attention to the regional and the role, for example, the African CDC, the African Centers for Disease Control, and the AU in contrast to COVAX and age regimes, and the question of will Africa have capacity to produce vaccines for the future and things like this. So with no more from me, however, let me invite Jane to respond to some of the questions that the discussants have raised that are partly responses to her talk and partly responses to the same questions that her talk also engaged. Jane, over to you.
Sure. How long do we have, Craig? I wasn't quite
sure.
Well,
we are past our time limit. I am taking the liberty of extending this since people are not voting with their mouses and signing off. There continues to be a large audience. I'm going to ask you to speak for 5 minutes or less, and then I'm going to try to give some chance to the audience, but we really are going to have to wrap up soon.
Sure, yeah. No, I really appreciate those, a really nice range of comments and thoughts and contributions from the other panelists, from very diverse kind of starting points. So it's difficult to know where to respond, really. I do think that, within our own countries, the particular politics of our own country's responses are already generating huge amount of interest and kind of research, and as we said, at all levels, really. And so there's so much to get into within that. But I really take your point, Craig, about the sort of the national, dominating a lot. And I think the other angle that's so much missed, really, is, and I think Adebayo kind of pointed to this, was that community level. Not only do we tend to look at things in a sort of nationalistic state by state kind of way, which, as he alluded to, we've all kind of retreated to our national identities, but we also kind of expect I think we, those of us in the OECD or whatever, expect states to do things. But in many parts of the world, people probably don't expect states to have the answers, because they don't really have much faith in those states, and those states maybe don't have much capacity for all kinds of reasons. And communities are really, really important to the responses, and the politics of those communities are determining, who gets treatment, who gets vaccines, and so forth. And I think there's a lot more that we need to know and look at in that. And I also thought that Marianne's points about the discipline needing to reflect, if it's going to be drawn into dealing with the media, dealing with politicians, and so forth. It does go back to some of the very early political scientists who often tried to draw a line between, activism and, or at least reflected on these issues, and drew a line between their research and the kind of public-facing roles. I think increasingly, at least in the UK anyway, we're being, in the UK, I'm not sure it's true of other parts of the world, there's a much greater demand now for academics of all kinds, scientists of all kinds, including social scientists, to be engaging and doing work which has a sort of, we call it impact, which has a real world effect, or kind of changes the world for the better. And political scientists in the UK are being sort of winkled out of their ivory towers or whatever, and kind of asked increasingly to do this. But I think Marianne raised really important questions about whether we're adequately prepared, and whether it's always appropriate to be doing that, and whether many of us may not think it is appropriate for academics to be getting involved And so I just thought that was what a lovely wide-ranging debate and the discussion we've had today from so many different perspectives. Really, really interesting.
Thank you, Jane. It's, I'm afraid, given time, going to be only a sort of token gesture to open the floor to participation from the wider group, but I want to make at least the token gesture and invite questions, and people may take up any of the range of themes that have been brought up about political science, about the pandemic, about politics in the world. And it strikes me to kick that off, the question running through some of this about the relation between politics on the one hand and state capacity on the other. A lot of the time when we talk about governments, we're not talking directly about the questions of who has power, but how much capacity states have to carry out health or other policies in all of this. And we've seen a variety of issues. As I wait for more questions, a first one is a request from Thomas Otieno Juma to speak very briefly, posing a question, I think, or a comment. Thomas. Thomas Otieno Juma? No? May have lost him. Have some comments. Nancy Wright has a comment raising a question. I'll restate it. She can elaborate further if need be. And I'm going to add slightly to it. She asks about South Pacific Islands, which have no COVID cases, or very few. The question about healthcare systems. I think, if I can reinterpret her question slightly, it runs along the lines of what's the relationship between, on the one hand, having effective healthcare systems able to do track and trace, to provide prevention and treatment, and on the other hand, the use of relatively blunt tools like isolation. And is there a natural experiment in the South Pacific Islands of what has been less naturally imposed by travel restrictions and lockdowns and bans? Does lacking an effective healthcare system necessitate blunter instruments that then become more disruptive?
Is that a question for me?
Yes, or anyone, but you in particular.
Yeah. I mean, the paper that I cited, Capano and all, that's what they were saying. I mean, that wasn't based on a sort of really, I think it was based on a small number of cases that they'd examined, but certainly that, have countries with really good health systems, I think just thought, oh, that's fine. Our system will be able to cope with this. So, there were the cases coming in and people getting sick was not so important. Whether having a less good health system leads to more blunt instruments, I'm not quite sure. But I mean, certainly there have been quite blunt instruments, especially. For example, in China, the case I know of at the beginning, they used very blunt instruments until they figured out how to do it in a more targeted way. They did move to more targeted approaches over time once they figured out what worked. But especially at the early stage of the pandemic, when people didn't really know what they were dealing with and how it was transmitted and all this kind of thing, definitely blunt instruments used.
And if I may, it seems to be the very state capacity that made possible the effective lockdowns in China also made difficult very early warning communications from local authorities in Wuhan to the central state. And so there's a paradox in that. I'm told there are hands raised, but I am not able to see raised hands in the way our screen is set up. And so, Anne, can you call on the people that you see as having raised hands?
Yeah, Craig, there's 3 hands raised. We have Natasha, Gitanjali, and Nzube. So shall I invite Nzube first?
In that order, please invite them. For reasons that are unclear to me, I can see only the panelists, not the full roster of participants.
So Nzube is now here. And if you'd like to, I think you already posted the question in the chat, but please feel free to ask it live again and make your contribution.
Okay. Hamia, can I say something? Hello,
We don't know who this is.
this is Nzube, Chukwuma Nzube.
Nzube, please go ahead and speak, Nzube.
Okay, I'm Chukwuma Nzube. I'm a PhD candidate. I'm a Nigerian, currently in China, Wuhan. I'm in Wuhan. My question is, I want to really know, why was it difficult in terms of looking at diplomacy, which is a branch of political science? There was these difficulties in trying to solve the issue among the global powers on the vaccine at the early stage of the pandemic. It became difficult in asking what was the role of political science discipline in trying to get key policymakers in within those institutions, trying to see how diplomacy would be able to solve the issue of challenges we face in terms of how to negotiate about the COVID vaccine and etc. Then my second question is, looking at the science of COVID in recent times, and there's this narrative that, yeah, for years you're talking about the environment, talking about how to reduce carbon. Now we are facing the issue of health. Is there a battle line between environmentalists focusing on environment, and also the medical practitioners talking about health? That you must first of all save health before environment, or you save environment before the health. Why I said this, because I had a conversation with a medical practitioner. He said, you pay footballers huge amounts of money in dollars and you neglect the health sector. Is there a battle line between, oh, we should focus on environment rather than health, or health rather than environment?
Does anyone from the panel, not everything is to Jane, but Jane, do you want to respond to this question of, are we face a battle of forced choice between health and environment?
Yeah, I don't know a lot about that subject, but what I do know, I mean, I think people would say that they're not really, a lot of health problems are actually environmentally driven, and that this is a sort of false kind of competition that's being set up. Clearly, well, I think in terms of the pandemic, people have said that, changes in the environment are the kinds of things, and the human interaction with the environment, that are enabling these kinds of viruses to evolve and spread, right? So that's a kind of example that's pertinent to our discussion today. But I think in other ways, the environment poor environment often has a detrimental effect on health. And so I think people in health would say we need to be looking more widely at health. It's not just about health systems and health and curing people. It's about understanding what makes for good health, and being preventive and looking at that. And it's true that too much resources usually goes into health systems and curing and finding very new, interesting kind of these fancy new medicines, but when in fact perhaps the bigger global problems of health would be solved by simpler preventive interventions.
Okay, Margaret, and then Marianne.
Sorry, I agree totally with what Jane has just said. It's really a false dichotomy, Nzube, to pit environment against health. There's a huge amount of research now going on about the ways in which our biology and our environment are very intertwined. And it's not just the new work on microbiomes, which is transforming our thoughts about health, but also about environmental conditions that affect that. But it's just an immense amount of work that's going on about the way in which we do work and how that affects our health conditions. And you could see that during the pandemic, where the environmental disasters for people who were trying to produce our food in the midst of a pandemic were intense. And so we have to get those things in appropriate balance. They are not conflicts. They work together badly, or they work together well, and we've got to make them work together well.
Okay, Marianne.
Yeah, I find this question very interesting, and I would tweak it a little bit in a different way, Zube. I would suggest that all or a lot of the questions we have been discussing and we are discussing in the context of COVID-19. So, for example, what Greg said about state capacity, about democratic rights limitation, about the trade-off between different goods like health and democracy, health and economy, about all the questions that also Jane brought up. All these aspects you could transfer to the same way to the climate crisis. So, I mean, you know, all these questions, we simply take them and put them and replace Corona or COVID-19 pandemic by a climate crisis. And then we can ask the same questions. Is state capacity relevant for solving this problem? Are we facing democratic rights limitations? Are we facing trade-offs between democratic rights and climate and measures for climate protection? Are we facing trade-offs between economic measures? I don't know. There are lots, and so on, so on. So I think the interesting thing of your question is, and I think this is really a perspective we as political scientists should envisage already now, that actually we are in two overlapping crises. We have the pandemic here, but we are already in the other crises, and the questions are so similar, and they are putting us in the same or in the position of reflecting about almost the same issues and topics. And I find this very urgent and very timely that we speak about it.
Thanks. Let me underline something that comes from Marianne's comments, which is the extent to which, in regard to both the pandemic and the climate crisis, political questions are often phrased as though we as citizens must make a choice between responding to these crises and economic prosperity and growth. And that becomes a framing and problematic political choice over and over again. Gitanjali Dash has a question. Let me call for. Can you hear me? And can you pose your question? You're muted, Gitanjali. Okay, we may get Gitanjali back in just a moment. Let me go on to another question from Natasha Adama. Or possibly
Hello.
Natasha Adama's dog, I'm not sure.
Yes, but I posted a picture of my dog. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. I have a question about the healthcare system, that if what Jane said, that healthcare societies where the healthcare system was robust and very good, the response to the pandemic was less effective. I don't agree with that, because I look at Taiwan. Taiwan is one of the cases that showed promise in the beginning because of the responses. After the vaccination came, they lagged behind. And I want to address that, and because that is something that needs to be researched, how they dealt with the pandemic at first and what happened after the fact. And I don't believe that it had to do with the healthcare system, but more with policy making that was not effective or effective enough. Another issue is that I want to address is the fact that the pandemic, as it came to us in waves, governments were a little bit unfamiliar, or not a little bit, they were unfamiliar. And the political communication, it had to do with political communication. And I want to know what people think about that, because what I see and watching, I study Germany, the Netherlands where I live. I look at England, Great Britain. And what I'm looking at is, when is there some advertising on TV telling people how to wash their hands, how to keep social distance, and whatnot, the Mohana rules and everything. And then I compare it to Vietnam, for example, where everyday people were, confronted with that kind of communication. Wash your hands, songs, everything. So why didn't it come about in the Netherlands, Germany, and all these Western societies? That is something I am interested in finding out. And the last thing is
we're gonna have to, I think, wrap up. We're running on a bit long for more questions. Let me note one that is similar to the last one that you asked from Klaver Bunja in the account, which is, to the extent that we are dealing with a crisis of politics, that the health crisis is politics and not just biomedicine, where do you see improvements in our political capacities coming, our political achievements? So anyone from the panel, and this will be the last and wrap up comments. Margaret, do you want to lead off?
Sure. So one of the things that I did at the beginning of the pandemic was agree to be part of something called Societal Experts Advisory Network, which was really bringing social scientists into the discussion into the discussion of science. It was sponsored by the National Academies in the US and the National Science Foundation. And one of the first things we heard from the health experts, from the health policy people, they had one message. They thought it would work for the whole society. And that was something that had to be unlearned by them. And we had to help them unlearn that and to start targeting the message. And I think that that's one of the things that's happening across the world, that there has been a huge reliance, and we see this in various countries, how they have dealt with the reliance on the health experts versus the political experts, or the people who understand how policy is communicated, in order to express what is going on. And this is an opportunity for learning. We can look, Taiwan did a remarkable job in communicating to its public, through a process that involved both the health experts and the policy experts. Other countries like the US did a really miserable job at the beginning because of failure of both political leadership and a commitment to a certain kind of health communication by the health world. So I think there's a lot of variation here, but it really has to do with targeting communication and understanding your publics and not relying only on technocratic science, understanding that this is a political and a policy problem that has to be resolved by a combination of those two.
It's maybe helpful that Taiwan has a head of state who is a social scientist with a PhD from the LSE. So, other wrap-up comments from any of our panelists? Or Dianne, for that matter, who gave us the welcome of IPSA.
No, I think that the Jane Duckett's lecture and the panelists' comments were absolutely wonderful. Thank you all very much.
Well, so let me echo the thanks then. Jane, terrific talk, really rich with information, including concrete citations and informations on literature. As indicated, we will post links to Jane's work and to some of the work she cited on this site. Let me thank all of the discussants. You raised great questions and added new information to the conversation. Thanks to IPSA and Dianne Pinderhughe for co-sponsorship. Thanks to all the colleagues at the ISC who made this possible, especially Jenya Toy, who has been organizing our technical presence in cyberspace. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.